The novel itself invites such constructions. Serialized in a new periodical, Master Humphrey's Clock, established by Dickens in 1840, the first-person narrator upon whom the first chapter alights has generally been referred to as Master Humphrey, who indeed appears elsewhere in the periodical as a narrator. G.K. Chesterton, who follows this convention with respect to The Old Curiosity Shop, nonetheless admits that it follows only from moral evidence, which some call reading between the lines. The evidence appears to be the very proliferation of the subject I in the opening chapter. Master Humphrey is a self-involved old cove. The narrator, in any case, does not introduce himself by name, and when he writes as the novel's opening sentence, "Night is generally my time for walking," Dickens may as well have been talking about himself. He did so in those terms 20 years later in the personal essay Night Walks he published in The Uncommercial Traveler. An old man who has been walking about at night, reflecting with some vicarious delight on the unwholesome streams of last night's debauchery that he encounters in Covent Garden, relates the following. One night I had roamed into the city, and was walking slowly on in my usual way, musing upon a great many things, when I was arrested by an inquiry, the purport of which did not reach me, but which seemed to be addressed to myself, and was preferred in a soft sweet voice that struck me very pleasantly. I turned hastily round and found at my elbow a pretty little girl, who begged to be directed to a certain street at a considerable distance, and indeed quite another quarter of town. "It is a very long way from here," said I, "my child." "I know that, sir," she replied timidly. "I am afraid it is a very long way, for I came from there tonight." "Alone?" said I, in some surprise. "Oh yes, I don't mind that, but I am a little frightened now, for I had lost my road." "And what made you ask it of me? Suppose I should tell you wrong?" "I am sure you will not do that," said the little creature. "You are such a very old gentleman, and walk so slow yourself." I cannot describe how much I was impressed by this appeal, and the energy with which it was made, which brought a tear into the child's clear eye, and made her slight figure tremble as she looked up into my face. "Come," said I, "I'll take you there." She put her hand in mine as confidingly as if she had known me from her cradle, and we trudged away together, the little creature accommodating her pace to mine, and rather seeming to lead and take care of me than I to be protecting her. I observed that every now and then she stole a curious look at my face, as if to make quite sure that I was not deceiving her, and that these glances, very sharp and keen they were too, seemed to increase her confidence at every repetition. We have here the materialization of a certain kind of pornographic fantasy, of older male benevolence and a pliable female gratitude, replete with details that would fit the scene quite easily into the maiden tribute of modern Babylon 40 years later, W.T. Stead's anti-prostitution polemic that enabled the passage of the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act. As Judith Walkowitz has remarked, Stead's own ferocious prose replicated, in a moralizing frame, many of the sadistic scenarios that filled pornography's pages. In one such replication, The Child Prostitute, Stead writes, "It seemed a profanation to touch her. She was so young and so baby-like. There she was, turned over to the first comer that would pay, but still to all appearance so modest, the maiden bloom not altogether having faded off her childish cheeks, and her pathetic eyes, where still lingered the timid glance of a frightened fawn. I felt like one of the damned." The narrator of The Old Curiosity Shop, likewise, felt really ashamed to take advantage of the ingenuousness or grateful feeling of the child for the purpose of gratifying my curiosity, yet he reports with a kind of troubled lasciviousness that she was more scantily attired than she might have been, and delights in the secretiveness she exhibits about her night's activity, a great secret, a secret which she did not even know herself. More pressing than the erotic dramaturgy of the scene, which must have been noticed by more of Dickens' readers than have publicly remarked on it, is the fate of the narrator positioned in the early part of the novel as a surrogate for the reader. He is, as we have seen, initially pulled into the plot by the girl, who will turn out to be Nell. He remains within its ambit purely through his own surreptitious device. When he has returned her to her grandfather, when, that is, he has arrived at the titular Old Curiosity Shop, by way of a spatial type of metalepsis, The narrator conducts a genial conversation with the old man. It always grieves me to contemplate the initiation of children into the ways of life, in which some of the exposition is extruded. Has she nobody to care for her but you? When his duty has been discharged and it is time to depart, however, the narrator finds himself unable to tear either his body or his thoughts away from the relationship between Nell and her grandfather, which he regards with a Humbert-esque mixture of tenderness, envy, and loathing of his Quilty-esque doppelganger. His affection for the child might not be inconsistent with villainy of the worst kind. Even in that very affection was in itself an extraordinary contradiction, or how could he leave her thus? Disposed as I was to think badly of him, I never doubted that his love for her was real. The narrator lingers, departs, and eventually returns a week later, yielding to his desire to return, at which point he is drawn into a sequence which introduces two of the novel's remaining major characters, Dick Swiveller and Daniel Quilp, at which point the narrator declares, "And now that I have carried this history so far in my own character, and introduced these personages to the reader, I shall, for the convenience of the narrative, detach myself from its further course, and leave those who have prominent and necessary parts in it to speak and act for themselves." One might expect his final words to indicate that what is to follow will consist of more first-person narrative, perhaps from multiple narrators, but indeed neither this narrator nor any other appears again to speak in the first person. It is a narratological volta with, as far as I am aware, only one analog, its reverse, in 19th century, 1800s, fiction. In William Morris's News from Nowhere, a third person adopts the first. But, says he, I think it would be better if I told my adventures in the first person, as if it were myself who had gone through them. We might conclude, with Tony Giffone, that the Old Curiosity Shop thus stages an early draft of the experiments with double narrative associated with the mature Dickens, with the interlocking first and third person narrators of Bleak House, for example, or the affective retrojection experienced by Pip as he describes his own childhood in Great Expectations. But to do so would be to undervalue the two strangest elements of this moment. First, that we have come to understand this character as, first and foremost, a lurker, and therefore cannot thereafter console ourselves that he has indeed left these characters alone. Perhaps the same unnamed character has merely affected a third-person style of narration in order to lurk more effectively. And second, that his recoil from first-person narration appears to be psychologically motivated, that in fact, it seems symptomatically consonant with the ambivalence and shame of his entire encounter with Nell and her grandfather. Although, that is, the narrator proudly finishes himself off at the end of the novel's first number, we can never be sure that we are finished with him. In a novel so concerned with the condition of spectatorship, a condition depicted directly in many of the illustrations by Cattermole and Phiz, we find ourselves in a more than usually paranoid relation to the apparently objective third-person narrator. This unnamed narrator is not therefore merely a pornographic reader himself, one who attributes the basest motives to Nell's grandfather, but an aperture through which pornography suffuses the whole narrative scene. Various characters appear at different moments as resurgences of the nameless narrator. The eavesdropping and malevolent dwarf, Quilp, who reveals his knowledge of the grandfather's gambling habit with the sinister threat, "You have no secret from me now." The urbane literary ventriloquist of eccentric habits, Dick Swiveller, perhaps above all the mysterious single gentleman, named after and at he answers to let a room, who takes great delight in lurking around Nell and her grandfather after the girl's death. For a long, long time, it was his chief delight to travel in the steps of the old man and the child, so far as he could trace them from her last narrative. In other words, I propose that the Old Curiosity Shop understands itself, doubtless paradoxically, as a porn parody of itself. We might understand porn parody as perhaps self-canceling, and perhaps pleonastic, meta-genre, by way of a major milestone in the genre, the 1991 movie Edward Penis Hands, in which someone who was not Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue played a Johnny Depp pastiche, except instead of having spindly blades for hands, a tragedy of overburdened preciousness, of finickiness taken literally, his wrist tapered into bulbous, somewhat repulsive cocks, In one scene, Edward Penis Hands attempts to eat a plate of spaghetti with his cock hands, but finds himself all fingers and thumbs, body twitching back and forth between grotesque phallic overcompensation and almost girlish, butter-fingered flimsiness. By relocating the phallus from penis to arm, Edward Penis Hands extends and amplifies the problem of phallic embodiment as such. The arms can indeed fuck and fuck hard, but they can't avoid looking stupid while doing so. And if the penis hands do not connect to the root chakra, one wonders whether the penis ever does either. Is one supposed to laugh or masturbate? Not Nikki Sixx, with his fiberglass arm cocks, is dick-fisting two girls who kneel on the bathroom floor, asses up, moaning the half-defeated, half-amused moans of the porn starlet, while he pouts like Pyrrho at the camera. And one type of pleasure one can imagine, a synthesis of porn and comedy, is the cruelty of the pornographic exhibition of women's bodies that one has, in effect, tricked into being humiliated. Another type of pleasure one can imagine, though, presumes that the three bodies performing this odd piece of vaudeville are coordinating their own arrhythmia quite democratically, and that the little moans correspond asymmetrically to Nikki's pout. Trans women are often accused of broadcasting pornographic images of womanhood, in some sense, of being pornography. The effect is more pernicious than a mere scapegoating, albeit that the minoritizing gaze that transforms trans women into wax porn women accelerates the general degradation of trans civil rights across the polity. But by leaving open the possibility of a return gesture, of treating the pornographic sign as an illustration of transness, contemporary anti-trans ideology universalizes the pornographic gaze across the body of the social. In conclusion, then, let us consider the regime of clockiness that the porno-universalism of the present has produced. When we talk of clockiness, we switch the conventional modes of active and passive assumed by most models of aesthetic judgment. If I refer to an aspect of my embodiment as clocky, I attribute to myself a capacity, what James Gibson might call an affordance, for a particular kind of interpretation, even as I distance myself from the interpretation itself. My Adam's apple, let's say, might mark me as someone whose embodiment is conditioned within the category of male, but that claim alone does not amount to an ascription of clockiness, which is present if and only if the marking itself would be, in my view, incorrect, that is, if I would not categorize myself as male. So, clockiness is not exactly a symptom, but an openness to the symptomatology of the other, not a property of the perceiving subject, but an anticipation of observance. We see too, then, that clockiness exposes the transsexual body as, in the Marxian sense, a relational condition. There is no transsexuality that precedes either clocking, the anticipation of clocking, or the evasion of clocking, much as there is no use value prior to exchange, whether of the laboring body or of any other commodity. On these grounds, trans-Marxists have redeployed the otherwise contentious vocabulary of gender to explain aspects of trans embodiment as relation. In her important essay, Gender as Accumulation Strategy, Kay Gabriel argues that gender is a set of claims made upon bodily pleasure. Relatedly, the transmasculine Marxists Jordi Rosenberg and Paul Preciado have developed differently accelerationist accounts of gender as a species or capital peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. Clockiness, of course, predates the modern transsexual, as anyone who has read Chaucer knows well. It is true that the negative condition of clockiness, as a currency form of transsexual embodiment, generates a slew of oddball effects. While we may, of course, be frightened to be clogged, and for many trans sex workers, primarily black trans women, who remain the central targets of anti-trans violence, clocking could be a life or death matter. We may also view the very fact of being mistaken as a source of pleasure, of secret knowledge. Writers on T4T sexuality, like Cam Awkward-Britch and Hal Melantino, often emphasize the visibility of transness as an erotic token. Yet it isn't clear whether these enchantments fundamentally differ from immiseration by capital or from the erotic relations between bodies conditioned by the coercive extraction of surplus labor power by capital. Perhaps we eroticize wealth, but it isn't clear that that condition prohibits an apparently countervailing delight in the bodies of workers, and this distinction is all the more important if we see, as Gabriel does, developing arguments by sex workers like Femi Babylon and feminist theorists of sex work, hotness itself as an effect of the extraction of feminizing, and racializing labor, rather than, for example, as a condition of consumption. Thus, a key question of trans women's experiences, whether beauty is produced by laborers or purchased by consumers, reproduces in a curious way a central question of 19th century aesthetics. In her indispensable history of the period, Regina Gagne argues that the marginalist revolution of the Middle Victorian period, a theory of value developed by Stanley Jevons, focused on the relative values, or marginal utility, of various priced commodities, overwhelmed prevailing aesthetic theories of productive labor, such as those of John Ruskin, with theories of consumption and taste, personified in Oscar Wilde. What even is clockiness? Extracting a definition only from a context, the first and most fundamental principle of Marxist method, unfamiliar readers will have perhaps already realized that the term refers to aspects of trans embodiment, especially trans women's embodiment, that supposedly give us away, that undermine our attempts to pass. You have presumably also realized that the term indicates a certain ambivalence, fear yes, but also perhaps a fond shimmer, as Charlie MacBrader has written about in his recent essay on trans cringe. What I suspect that you cannot have guessed, but which any trans person could confirm at a stroke, is that clockiness is not unidirectional, that, despite appearance, a clocky appearance is not one which exposes a trans woman as secretly a man. It is just as likely to expose a trans woman as secretly a woman. Because it is a symptom that only exists for the observer, one cannot determine in advance exactly what meanings will be assigned to it within a given setting. At Heathrow Airport on Tuesday, dressed up in my best boy mode so as to match the name on my legal travel documents, I was frog-marched out of the men's toilets by two agitated attendants, a man and a woman, both saying quite forcefully, Madame, you are in the wrong place." Clockiness does not expose a referent so much as muddle reference altogether. A couple of weeks earlier, similarly butch for an appointment at the American Embassy, one cop said to his supervisor, "She's got an appointment," before his colleague, gently chiding, corrected him, "They've got an appointment." Clockiness resurfaces once again the unfortunate problem of ontology, or at least requires some calibration of how trans embodiment depends upon a strategic refusal of any and all demands for ontologization. With all its ambivalences, it thwarts any ontological position, demarcating as it does a social regime under which the body is transformed into language, or rather, by which the body's resistance to being so transformed occasions some form of crisis. To acknowledge one's own clockiness, an acknowledgement whose extent is in principle, although not by definition universal, is to articulate the transsexual condition that, within psychoanalytic thought, precedes and conditions the developmental drama of sexuation. We can illustrate the negative, or rather instrumental, quality of clockiness through the perhaps surprising medium of cake simulacra, a comparison made to me by a British scholar of international relations, also an anti-trans campaigner, named Colin White, albeit that he characteristically spectacularly missed the point. Showing me photographs of some cakes in the shape of burgers, White took issue with the claim that the basically unclockable trans porn actor Buck Angel is a man, suggesting that the claim amounted to saying that these cakes were in fact burgers. Yet, since the cakes were utterly clockable, were meant to signify burger, but not truly to resemble burgers, White inadvertently confuted his own position. As he may not have known, cake simulacra have been a popular and consequential meme type over the last few years, even spinning off a Netflix quiz show, Is It Cake?, in which contestants are invited to build cakes in the shape of various objects that they can then pass off. When one watches an Is It Cake video, one experiences, for the first few seconds, incredulity, which only mounts as the knife, the agent of bisection and thus of exposure, approaches. But as the knife pushes into the soft fondant exterior, the object being exposed as cake is revealed simultaneously to be substantial in an entirely distinct way. The fondant into which the knife presses warps slightly, producing a visual distortion akin to a lens flare or a switch in perspective, and although cake is the name for the object that is exhibited at the end of the video, that object can be cake only in an unusual sense. It isn't there to be eaten, only to be cut. Its sensory and its substantial aspects are both allegorical, which is to say indexical. Somehow the Is It Cake video succeeds in depicting cakes that are less cake-like than even the objects whose shapes they've taken. The Is It Cake video thereby offers a rejoinder to Margaret's famous "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," not because in the end, c'est un gâteau, but because the videos expose the potential cake-likeness of all objects, even a pipe, even a painting of a pipe. Transflesh is flesh, regardless of which direction it has transitioned, regardless of whether, in fact, it has transitioned at all. The Is It Cake video exploits the porous border between two forms of visual observance, the skeptical observance, surely this cannot be cake, and the pornographic observance, the knife teaches us the essential nature of matter. In his short and unusual book on Margaret's painting, Michel Foucault describes the work as a calligram, that is, as a kind of text shaped like its referent. His basic claim about the painting is that it comprises a sort of negative tautology. It is both true and false, and works to convert meaning into shape and vice versa. He goes on, pursuing its quarry by two paths, the calligram sets the most perfect trap. By its double function, it guarantees capture, as neither discourse alone nor a pure drawing could do. It banishes the invincible absence that defeats words, imposing upon them, by the ruses of a writing at play in space, the visible form of their referent. Cleverly arranged on a sheet of paper, signs invoke the very thing of which they speak, from outside, by the margin they outline, by the emergence of their mass on the blank space of the page. And in return, visible form is excavated, furrowed by words that work at it from within, and which, dismissing the immobile, ambiguous, nameless presence, spin forth the web of significations that christen it, determine it, fix it in the universe of discourse. A double trap, unavoidable snare. How henceforth would escape the flight of birds, the transitory form of flowers, the falling rain? We might think of clockiness as a related kind of trap, and trap itself, of course, is a term which denotes the precarity of the clockable woman. The transsexual is a calligrammatic woman, both reference and referent, index and indexed, and the consequence of the transsexualization of flesh is no less epiphanic than those of the Foucauldian calligram, the irresistible ascription of meanings to forms one discovers in the world.